Welcome, everybody. Good morning. What a beautiful day here in the nation's capital. My name is David Globerman, and I will be your host today. I am the coordinator of supporting cast with PAL Ottawa. And for those of you that don't know about PAL, PAL is a nonprofit organization here in Ottawa. It's actually a chapter-based organization, and the main mission is to provide affordable housing, a very timely topic given today's presentation, as well as health and social supports for both retired and active arts workers in Ottawa. Before we get started, I would just ask that you mute your microphones, which everybody has. You can be on camera or off camera, it's up to you. We're actually recording this session because there were or are about almost 30 registrants, but a lot of people cannot attend. So for those people, as well as other people that want to have an opportunity to view this presentation, they'll be able to go to our PAL YouTube channel. And also the slides that Katie and Stephanie will be showing today will be up on our website probably next week sometime, so you'll have a chance to see those as well. If you have any questions, which I'm sure you will, you can submit them in the chat function, and after both Katie's and Stephanie's presentation, we'll try to address as many of the questions as you have. And there's a running tab on the chat function. So hopefully we'll be able to get to everybody's questions, especially given this timely topic. Today's presentation is part of the Spring into Summer series, which started in May and will continue into June. And we have a wide array of different topics, not just sort of arty presentations, but presentations dealing with nutrition and housing and pharmaceutical management and things like that. So it's really we've had some really terrific presentations that are educational, enlightening, and fun. And we hope that you continue to check our website, because the website is being updated all the time, because we're still booking a lot of presentations to the end of June. So it's going to be really busy to the end of June. So I really encourage you to do that. Our presenters today will be Stephanie Cadieux. Stephanie actually is pinch hitting for Sarah Bercier, who unfortunately cannot be here today due to a family issue. So Stephanie is kind enough to have parachuted in to help us out. And Stephanie is the Director of Education with the Council on Aging with Ottawa, a very well organization here in the nation's capital that does a lot of great work. And she'll tell you more about herself. And our second presenter is Kaite Burkholder Harris. And Katie is the Executive Director at the Alliance to End Homelessness. So our two presentations, one dealing with affordable housing, the other one dealing with homelessness. The populations are not mutually exclusive. There is overlap between them. So this will be a really interesting presentation from our two presenters, and telling you about what's going on in these areas. What are the challenges? What's the history, and what can we expect going forward? So I will turn it over to Stephanie first, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself, Stephanie.
Sure. Thanks for the intro. So as David mentioned, I'm the Director of Education with the Council on Aging of Ottawa. I'm sort of new, actually. I'm coming up on 1 year, but I've been working on contract with them. I thoroughly enjoy working with this organization. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the Council on Aging, we do lots of great outreach in the community, trying to raise awareness about a multitude of issues affecting senior populations in Ottawa. And we just want to make sure that older adults are aware of what's happening, the issues that affect them, and also to kind of encourage them to take action, because there's a lot of things that can change if we put a little bit of effort into, talking about it with our friends or family members. The more awareness is raised, the more we can all, collectively kind of bring these items to attention to our municipalities, our province, our MPPs, our MPs, and just get the word out there and get the ball rolling. So I, like David mentioned, I'm kind of sitting in for Sarah today. I'm not 100% familiar with the content of this presentation. I'm giving you a heads up right now, but I will do my very, very best. So I might as well just start by doing a screen share here. So what we're going to be talking about today are housing options in general for people on a limited income. Now, obviously, as we start getting older, there's lots of questions that come about, about whether we should stay where we currently live. Should I be moving? Is this, are these lodgings that I'm in currently going to be suitable to me 5 or 10 years down the road? And obviously, we want to provide you with a bit of an overview of those things that you need to consider that will ultimately help you make those kinds of decisions, because we know that housing, it's not just lodgings. It's not just bricks and mortar. It's a home. It's a place where we feel safe, where we should be happy and not constantly worried about things falling apart. And it's also a community, right? If you feel like you're connected to your neighborhood, the people that live in it, these are all really important factors. And we want to make sure that people make the right decisions, also to stay, and live independently as long as possible. So what we're going to be covering today, a lot of it is actually included in this document here. I know you see probably it flipped here, but this is the a guide that we published. At the Council on Aging, we have an action committee dedicated to housing issues. And so in the last few years, they've been compiling this great guide for older adults that presents those housing options. And so actually, David has a copy of this housing guide and a bunch of other materials that we wanted to share with you. And those will be distributed to you sometime after the end of this presentation, or maybe they'll be posted on the website. I'm not sure how, David, you were planning on going about it, but either way, you will get your hands on this stuff, and there'll be great tools for you to help kind of figure out all these things, because it really is a planning process, right? And it is important to plan ahead, because you don't want to have to think about where you're going to live and what you're going to do if you're in a moment of crisis. Like what if you all of a sudden find yourself having a stroke, and all of a sudden you don't have the same faculties as you did before. You might have mobility issues with memory. You need assistance, and you can no longer live where you are. So it is important to make some plans and to ensure that you end up being in a place that will make you happy. Ultimately, that's what we want, right? So you got to ask yourself, where do you want to be 2 years down the road? Is where you live now completely appropriate, or are there maybe some things that might need to change? There's a lot of things to consider, and this presentation and the tools that we're going to give you will hopefully help confirm whether or not you're in the right place. So who knows, maybe some of you have already given some thought to this, have already looked at alternatives. Either way, we hope that this material helps point you in the right direction, get you going in the right direction, and maybe also provide some support to others who might find themselves in a pickle of a situation, and they're at that point where they need to start looking because they notice that they're having issues going upstairs, or all of a sudden they have mobility aids and their house is not appropriate for them anymore. The hallways are too small or narrow. And anyways, so you'll have some homework, obviously, ahead of you after this session, which is good. That's what we want, right? So right now, where you are, you need to consider what it is that that maybe led you to move there. What are the things that are important to you? So it is important to start early and to start thinking about what your current health situation is like, how it might change in the future. You might also have caregiving responsibilities, right? There's a lot to kind of um, weed out and determine to be able to make an appropriate choice. So I don't know, maybe what would be the ideal place for you? Is it in a single home in a community? Are you better off in an apartment building just for seniors? Do you like to mingle with other younger generations? Do you prefer being in a place that's really, more natural surroundings where, you've got hiking trails just a 5-minute walk away from where you live? Do you need to absolutely be somewhere? Maybe it's a walkable community where, in a 15-minute walk, you can get to your grocery store, you can go to the library, you can maybe access healthcare. So you need to ask yourself, what is important for you and what would ultimately make a place feel like home for you? Because you do want to prepare before something happens and you're forced to move into a place that you really didn't plan on going to. So you need to kind of ask yourself, what it is exactly that you want and write these things down. And as I mentioned in this housing guide that you'll be receiving, it includes tons of different kinds of options that currently exist. And hopefully you'll be able to go through this and you'll get some good ideas from it. So here are some key things that you need to consider before settling on an option. I mean, you might have already figured out, like, I'm totally a renter. I couldn't be bothered with, having to mow the lawn or shovel the driveway of snow. Maybe financially, this is all that is possible for me right now. But it's not all just finances as well. Yes, there's a scarcity of available rental units or for low income older adults out there. There's wait lists, etc. But you can still look at things and look at alternative options that will accommodate whatever needs that could pop up, such as health and mobility. So with health and mobility, do you have mobility issues right now? Do you use a mobility aid? Do you need to have access to elevators? Maybe you have a friend as well who is in a wheelchair, very, very good friend who you do want them to be able to access your residence where you live. And maybe it's you need to have access to certain care providers. So there's a lot that I could follow through on this topic, but I think you get where I'm going with this. Next is caregiving. A lot of older adults are caregivers for loved ones, could be for friends as well. And maybe you're a person, or might eventually be, let's hope not, but someone who needs to receive care. So if you decide to move somewhere, where would it potentially hinder your caregiver's ability to come and provide care to you? Or if you need to provide care to someone, do you want to move closer to them because you're tired of taking a bus for an hour and a half every day to get where you need to go? Community services and supports. Obviously, if you need to receive some sort of care, you want to make sure that you live somewhere where, again, those services are available. So you might really love the idea of being in nature, but if you move out into a more rural area, will you still be able to access those really important services that you need? Transportation is a great example. So if you decide to move in a rural area, well, public transportation is practically non-existent. So you have to rely on community support services that might have a transportation program. Like here in Ottawa, I know the Ross. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, but they provide transportation services to and from medical appointments, to groceries. However, all that needs to be planned and organized. So there's a lot of factors to consider here. If you move, or you're going to be far away from all of your friends and family. Yes, you've always dreamed to move, I don't know, to the Maritimes, but you don't know anyone there. Well, that might be a problem if at some point you need support. Or if you're more of an introverted person, you could potentially put yourself in a self-isolating situation. And of course, there's finances. This is the big one. Like I said, this is the big driver, right? Is it affordable? If you have a certain income now, maybe there'd be a reduction. If you are with a partner and your spouse passed away, would your income be affected? Would it not? And which way? It's important to think about these things and to be able to ensure that you don't become at risk of homelessness either. So what I want to introduce you to is the 4 A's of housing. These are really the things that we want you to focus on when considering your options. So first of all, you want to check and see if it's affordable, if it's accessible, if it's appropriate to your needs, and also if it's available. Obviously, in Ottawa, we have some challenges in that department. So what is affordable housing? A house or lodgings is considered affordable if it costs 30% less than your annual income. Okay, and costs included in that are your mortgage, your rent, okay, whichever one, if you own or you rent, your utilities like hydro, gas, water. This includes paying for property taxes, obviously not applicable if you're renting, but you might be paying condo fees, or you could also be paying insurance. Okay, so 30% covers those costs. Okay, everything else is considered fluff. Although in my opinion, that fluff can become really, really important, especially as you're getting older. So, so when we are looking, I don't know, if you earn $25,000, then what would typically be an ideal situation for you is rent that costs about $500 to $700 per month. So that. And for today here in Ottawa is a joke, right? I mean, if you bought your house quite a while ago, you might actually be able to pull this off. If you're a renter and you've been grandfathered in from a long time ago, you might be able to pull this off as well. But if you're considering a new move, this is not really something you'll find easily. Obviously, there's social housing that if you really need to, you could sign onto the social housing registry, but the wait lists are really, really long. Anyway, so this little table here shows you approximately what you would be uh, able to comfortably afford in terms of monthly rent based on your income. Okay, now I don't know if you have savings, obviously that could increase your budget. Okay, so that is something to consider. Also, you might have inherited some money, a pension of a spouse who passed away. I mean, there's a lot here that you need to factor in because obviously right now the current market is insane. I mean, the average cost of a 2-bedroom apartment is like $1,500. For 1 bedroom, it's $1,200. And some statistics that I found actually showed that 42% of renters are currently paying more than 30% of their income. So that's an important issue that obviously we as a city need to look at addressing. And you know, it could be looking at alternative options as well. There's lots out there. There's naturally occurring retirement communities, there's co-sharing your house, there's cooperative housing, there's a lot of options out there. But to get you going on in the right direction, we're going to be providing you with this little housing budget calculator. So this will help you figure out what you can currently afford and what you can't in the future, right? So this is going to help you figure out what you're currently paying and whether or not this is going to be affordable for you in the future. So anyways, and I don't know if you can see it. You might have the little video feeds on the right-hand side of your screen. But as I mentioned earlier, that 30%, you know, those costs that are included in that 30%, though it's the top 7 items here, from mortgage to home insurance, everything else. So renovations and landscaping and plowing snow, and our luxury items like internet that allowed you to be here today, and phone and cable and house cleaning. These are all other expenses. And obviously, as we get older, we have bad knees. House cleaning, you know, might be something that we have to pay as a service so that we can maintain our lodging. So very, very useful to kind of explore this this calculator on your own time afterwards, after this session. So the second A is accessible, if you'll remember. So obviously, an accessible home means that it's designed so that you can live independently, essentially. Okay, so that it accommodates whatever health concerns, disabilities, mobility issues that you might have that often come with age. So, you know, we're looking at installing grab bars in bathrooms, and maybe some railings in the hallways. You know, if you currently live in a place where there's lots of stairs, well, that might not be really great for you down the road. Maybe you're very fit and you're fine with stairs, but you know, you have to constantly just assess every once in a while, is this place still, you know, suitable for me? And like I mentioned earlier, if you have people who do have mobility issues that are coming to your house, then you want to make sure that it's visitable. Okay, meaning that again, the hallways or passageways, I should say, are large enough that they're clear. The doorways are wide, and if maybe I don't know, you plan on sharing a rental unit with someone, because this is a good way of reducing some expenses, right? Maybe you have to look for an accessible unit. Now, usually in an apartment building, there'll be a few accessible units. So that could make your search a little more difficult, but it would be important. So if you have a friend who, you know, requires the assistance of a wheelchair, you know, an accessible unit would mean that those, you know, hallways and doorways are wide enough that the counter would be lower, the stove would be lower, easier access to the washroom, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Whoop, I went through that pretty quickly. Sorry. Now let's talk about actually, just to go back to the accessibility. If any of you at any point require, you know, need to modify your home, you need to do some renovations in your home so that it is more accessible for you, there are some programs that will provide some subsidies so that you can install those important features in your home. Now, obviously, if you're renting, you might not have permission. So it is important to also maybe look at moving into a place where you would have the permission to do those kinds of modifications that would allow you to live there longer. Okay. All right, so now we'll move on to appropriate housing. So with the appropriate housing, obviously we just want it to be able to meet your changing needs, okay? And also making sure that it's in a good state. So, if it's in a state of disrepair, then you might want to consider moving. Is this the size of your home appropriate? What kind of space would you need? Obviously, with downsizing, you could be getting rid of a lot of things, but maybe also you want to have more space because you're moving in with someone, or potentially down the road, someone might move in with you. Someone you're caring for presently at a distance might end up having to move in with you. We also want to make sure that you have access to transportation. That might be not important for some people who have a driver's license, but for others who don't, it would be a really key feature to be looking for, to have a bus stop, just a 5-minute walk from your door. So you want to make sure that you consider all of these things, and also that it's appropriate for your lifestyle. Like, I know with PAL, I'm assuming, a lot of people are artistically inclined. So maybe you want to find a space that will allow you to be creative. Where you could make use of your medium. Like if it's I don't know, if you're an artist who works on large pieces, and you'd need large space, good ventilation, et cetera, right? If you're a pet lover, well, you need to make sure you move into a space that's pet friendly and will allow pets. So lots of things to unpack here, but essentially it's just helping you figure out what would be appropriate for you. Availability is the biggest issue. It's the biggest challenge, which is why you really need to figure out what's more important to you. To live in the same neighborhood that you are right now? Does it need to be more affordable? Do you need to move closer to friends or family? Right now, the wait for social housing is about 6 years. Now, I was super thrilled to hear that PAL, provides support services, and they're also building, I believe, residential units as we speak that will open in a couple of years from now. But anyways, I just wanted to say that I was very, very glad, because there's not a lot of options that are affordable currently. So it's great to see this kind of initiative happen in the community. Now, to help you make some decisions, well, in this housing guide that we'll be providing you with, there's a checklist there. And that checklist will really help you evaluate how appropriate your house is now. And so that you can figure out as well what you might need to look for in a house in the future. So it includes like questions like, right now, are parts of your home difficult to navigate? Is it easy to walk around and to move through? Is your laundry currently accessible, or do you have to go down 4 flights of stairs to be able to access it? Or maybe you live in an apartment building and you have access to an elevator, but in times of COVID, you don't you don't like the close proximity to other people in the room. I don't know, I'm just making things up here, but can you safely walk in your neighborhood? Maybe you love to walk, and during the winter, right now, the sidewalk that lines your street is all crooked and there's risks of falls, and you've noticed a decline in your health since you can't go and walk anymore during winter. And maybe, if you have enough funds, you can easily find somewhere to move to where the sidewalks are great. Like there's so many things to consider here. Is healthcare accessible nearby? Is there like a walk-in clinic, or maybe your own doctor, because you require constant follow-up, and you're tired of having, like I said earlier, taking the bus for an hour to get where you're going, right? So is there parking on site? There's so many things here. So this checklist that's in this guide will help you figure out if your current home is appropriate, or if you need to move, and it'll at least give you an idea of what features you need to look for in your new place. Okay. Now there's lots of housing options. Okay. I'm not going to go ad nauseum through it because we've provided all those options in this book. But obviously we can branch it out into three main groups. There's either you're an owner, either you're a renter, or you're considering moving into a residence of some sort, retirement home, and maybe it's long-term care. Hopefully not, you know. But if you're owning, do you plan on staying with you where you are and don't plan on doing any renovations? Do you want to stay and do some modifications so that it remains accessible for you? Do you have the funds to build um, or buy something that is more suitable to your needs? There's more and more houses that have been modified for older adults to make sure that you know it's more easily to navigate and to move around in the house. You know, maybe it's sharing too. Maybe you want to share, you own a house and you want to share it with others. There's this whole idea of intergenerational housing as well now, where you'll have older adults who have university students come and rent a room. Well, that will help reduce costs for sure. And maybe there can be an arrangement made there as well where they can do some chores that are more difficult for you. So, and you know, it helps keep things fresh and interesting when there's a young person around. Uh, Obviously, there's renting. Renting right now, the market rate is well, like I said, ridiculous. You heard me earlier. A 2-bedroom is like $1,500, and the vacancy rate is really low. It's at like it was at 1.8% back in 2019. I'm not sure what it's at right now, but a healthy vacancy rate in the city is between 3 and 5%. So, I mean, you can do the math. We know there's an issue there. So if you're looking for rentals, there's obviously social housing. If that's not a market rate is not affordable, there's social housing. Get your name on the registry if you haven't already. And there's obviously cooperatives, which I believe is, well, I mean, in my mind, it sounds like what PAL is doing, right? It'd be more of a cooperative model. I'm not sure. Am I? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I'll let David kind of weed out those details later. If need be. And then there's the retirement homes. So if at some point you're no longer able to stay in your home because you need a certain amount of care and supervision, maybe you might need to go to a memory unit. Your family is not able to take you in, whatever it is. There are retirement homes, but costs are through the roof. A lot of people, before going into a retirement home and starting to do their homework, there's often sticker shock. I'll call it sticker shock. You see the price and your jaw drops and your heart slows down. It really is quite difficult if you do not have the means. However, there are some retirement homes that are cheaper. In Ottawa, there's like 3 of them really that come to mind. I wrote them down here. There's Camilla Gardens, and there's in Orleans, there's the Blackburn Seniors Residence, and then there's Cumberland Lodge in Cumberland, obviously. And those are about $1,500 a month. Now, obviously, any kinds of extras like services, meals, housekeeping, that would all come at additional costs. But at least those are some pretty reasonable rates. I can say with certainty that if you go across the border to Quebec, to another province, it is cheaper, but that might come with a whole slew of other issues, right? So it really is up to you to do your homework. You can definitely just call retirement homes. A lot of them provide information, but you can stay for a weekend and, you know, experience what it is to be in a retirement home community, right? The activities, and get a sense of whether people are happy there. You can talk to the residents and see how they feel about their home, right? So there's some good opportunities there. Just don't be shy and do some digging and look into it. Because yeah, I mean, a retirement home might be great, especially if you're social. There's plenty of opportunities to socialize, right? So, and then obviously, if none of these options become possible for you, if you're on a social housing registry and you're waiting and you've been waiting for a long time, maybe you've just signed up, sharing a home could really help cut some of those expenses. I think I skipped the slide there, sorry. But it could really help cut some of those costs back, okay? But there's obviously lots of things to consider before you go and share a home with someone. You know, obviously there's many options. You could, if you're a homeowner, you could have people come and move into your home and rent space. You could do the Golden Girls model where you and some friends, collectively look to rent a space or to buy a house together. And you guys just come up with some sort of arrangement to help support each other. You could also do the intergenerational thing where you can have a student move in with you. There's lots and lots of different options, but the key thing here is obviously flexibility. If it would living with someone be a good fit for you. You need to think about issues around privacy. Obviously, your bedroom would probably be private, but there'd be lots of shared space like the kitchen and the living room, and you guys would have to determine those limits and set some boundaries, maybe also create some rules. So what if you want to have a person come stay over for the night? Would your roommate be happy with that or not? Right? There's lots. We want to obviously avoid any kinds of conflicts, and so maybe figuring out what every person's financial obligations would be. Maybe you want to split the costs evenly, kif everyone. Or maybe one person pays the rent and then the other pays all the utilities and it's under their account, under their name. There's so much to work out, but it is possible. And if you do think you'll be getting along with this person, it could be worth it. Now, if I were to think of me personally, if I were to move in with my best friend, it would not work out. Because my best friend is really bossy and nitpicky, and it is very I don't want to say confrontational. If something bugs her, she won't shy away. She'll be very vocal and let the other person know, which is great. But there's potential for conflict there. Okay, so you have to make sure that the person you're going to move in with is going to that there'll be some meshing of the personalities there. Okay, so just ask yourself too, what happens if it doesn't work out? Is your friendship or relationship with your family as well potentially at risk, right? Because we didn't think about that part either. What if you have to move in with a family member because there's a decline in your health? You're definitely going to want to have those difficult conversations with your loved one when you move in. Maybe they're providing care and support with you to like get dressed in the morning and provide meals and bring you to doctor's appointments, whatever it is, what kind of support it is that they're providing. But that also leads to the possibility of burnout. So you want to make sure that when you have those conversations with your family, that it's quite clear that if they feel like they can't do it anymore or they need a break, they need to be very upfront with you and let you know what's going on. And you have to also be flexible and not offended by that either, because it is a lot to do. It's a physically and mentally demanding to provide care for someone. It could also be a fantastic way of solidifying that relationship and increasing those bonds. So it is really a beautiful thing. But there is that danger that things can go awry, and that could potentially ruin your relationship as well. So it's a balancing act. So you need to make sure you talk about this stuff. So, I mean, like I said, hopefully this provided a good little overview for you. Maybe, in listening to me talk about all this stuff, you figured that, hey, I need to move, or maybe, no, I'm going to stay. Things are fine. But this is essentially just a recap of the process, right? So make sure that you consider your needs and what your preferences are. Look at your options, get all the info you need. And then compare that to your current situation. If you want to have a place that's, in nature, not urban, and you might have to sacrifice transportation. Are you going to be able to do that? Right? So you've got to consider what is important for you. And then when the affordability factor comes in, then it might reduce those options that you have. But you can still find those things that are the most important for you. Maybe it's absolutely having a pet. That is, you have a pet, you've always had pets, you're not willing to part with your pet. That's a deal breaker right there. So once you've gathered all that information, you look at how much the costs are, compare them with what it is now, what it might be in the future, and then use this kind of information, this guide and the checklist that we're going to provide you with to help you make that decision. I just wanted to share this little quote here. Actually, it's Maya Angelou that said this. She said, "The ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned." I find that the essence of what was discussed here today really captures those ideas. When you're looking for a home, you want to make sure it's a place you're going to be safe, that you're going to be happy in, and that you won't feel like it's a burden to you. Your home should not be a burden. So, if it doesn't meet your needs anymore, then maybe it is time to consider moving, right? So once you get all these materials, I strongly suggest you read them, do your budget, go through the checklist that's in the guide, figure out whether or not you need to follow up on any of this stuff. I just wanted to do a little plug-in here. At the Council on Aging, we offer the Smart Aging program. It's a program of 8 weeks, okay? It's 8 courses on different topics that affect older adults. And it's all geared towards preparing you to handle those transitions that can happen. So whether it's preparing for a health crisis, or looking at housing, you need to move, or addressing some financial concerns that you have, or having to make change to your life so that you adopt a healthier lifestyle. We have this program. If you're interested, I strongly suggest you visit our website. It's coaottawa.ca. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. And I'll be sticking around, obviously, to answer questions. But for now, I'll be turning things over back to Kaite Burkholder, who, as David already mentioned, is from the Alliance to End Homelessness, and she'll hopefully give us some context around the issue of homelessness in Ottawa, and highlight the need for better social housing, and what you as a person and what us as a community can do to put an end to homelessness. So thank you very much. Kaite, take it away. I will stop the share.
That was fantastic, Stephanie. And I'm now afraid there may be a little bit of overlap, but I'm not too worried.
Okay.
That was great. And I think I'm really appreciative of the chance to speak with all of you today, especially around the way that these things are a continuum and that they are linked, right? The housing crisis is the thing that has caused homelessness. And so when we don't have enough affordable housing, it has this downstream effect. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hope that it works. And I think it will, because we tested it. All right. Can everyone see this?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, homelessness in Ottawa. I'll share a little bit about the local context as well as the national picture that got us here. And just so you have a sense of who the Alliance is, we are a member-driven organization. PAL is actually one of our agency members. We're almost 70 agencies in the city of Ottawa. And a lot of our work is on systems planning and systems change, mobilization, doing presentations, the education piece, and really looking at greater coordination. You know, lots of agencies do really critical frontline work, and there's an increasing need for that kind of system level vision of how we can all work together to make sure that people have the services and supports they need to end their homelessness. So I think before getting really into it, it's really helpful, and I think this was really highlighted in Stephanie's presentation as well. You know, homelessness is not just about not having a roof over your head, and Indigenous partners, and specifically Jesse Thistle, who's a Métis scholar, developed something called the 12 Dimensions of Indigenous Homelessness. And he has certainly said, you know, while it does apply to Indigenous peoples, it's also speaking to a wider concept that homelessness is actually about disconnection. It's actually about not having connection to community a lot of the time, obviously to, you know, physical space for a home, but also it has to do with our relationships with culture, land, with family and kin. And while that's very much in the Indigenous context, especially around cultural disconnection, it is something that he's spoken to wanting to apply it more broadly, because homelessness, we can put a roof over someone's head, but if we don't have a place that people feel safe, they feel comfortable, they feel like they can use that base to connect with broader community, we haven't really sort of stopped that homelessness, right? That's something that may continue because isolation and loneliness, I think, is one of the biggest challenges to making sure that people can stay housed. So to give you kind of a very broad picture, homelessness has changed a lot in the last kind of 40 years. And unfortunately, we're on, I would say, the tail end of a really terrible policy experiment. In the late 1980s, they started to reduce the number of housing units, of nonprofit housing units. The feds really stopped kind of funding a lot of that. But it was largely looking like single men who experienced kind of chronic homelessness themselves. That was certainly the image or the picture, often people who were white. And now when we look at the situation of homelessness across Canada, we have about 235,000 people experiencing homelessness in a year. That number is old. I would argue that it's higher at this point, and I think COVID has certainly added to that in terms of the number of people getting evicted, often through no fault of their own because they've lost income. And we've also seen an increasing diversity in the number of people experiencing homelessness. So in Ottawa right now, families are the biggest and growing group of people experiencing chronic homelessness. So we have about 8,000 people a year in Ottawa who experience homelessness, and that's only folks who are in the shelter system. Of that group, we have about 24% who identify as Indigenous, but we also know that that is an undercount. Indigenous partners routinely say, you know, nationally it's closer to 30 or higher percent, but in Ottawa, a lot of Indigenous partners don't use the shelters themselves, and there's different types of homelessness, including couch surfing. And so looking at that from a broader cultural lens is really important to think about how we understand this data. And finally, about over half experience chronic homelessness. So people who are in a shelter for 6 months or longer. And unfortunately, that sense of getting stuck in the rut of being homeless is something we're seeing increasing because there are less and less affordable housing options. So within sort of a nightly piece that looks like about almost 2,000 people every night, again, that has increased substantially during the pandemic. And when we look at the length of stay since 2014, we've seen a 12% increase. That number is important because in terms of other populations, we're actually seeing a slight decrease in the number of unique youth or the number of unique single men or unique single women, not in families, but even though there's less people, the people who are there are staying longer. So I'm not totally convinced that we actually are seeing less homelessness as much as there is no space in shelters to be able to accommodate the numbers. So why are we here? You know, we really didn't have homelessness in the 1980s. It was very small. And the idea of mass homelessness is a new concept. Even the word homeless didn't actually exist until the 80s. And I think what's important to look is the historical perspective on this. You know, in the 1930s, the concept of homelessness was more about poor housing conditions. You know, the idea of people living in slums or just not having quality housing in particular neighborhoods, but they still had a roof over their head. And then you look at the post-war era and a lot happened. The creation of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which did a lot of creation of new rental units. There was a lot of taking down slums. And so places that had that kind of poor quality rental housing was really very much something that people wanted to get rid of. And I think this is really fascinating, but the mortgage was created, right? That makes home ownership actually accessible for people who wouldn't have that upfront money. And so as a result, there was also this emphasis on single family homes. And that was generally private development. But I think that really shifted the housing game for a lot of people. And I think what's really important to know is that, yes, the private home ownership market was taking off, but then in the 1970s, we kind of call it the height of the sort of social welfare state. There was a lot of supports for people. And as we move forward into the 1980s, we really started to look at cutting down on funding. And what I think is relevant at the height of that time, we were building, or the federal government was investing in 20,000 affordable housing units per year. So what that did look like a lot of the time were those large kind of high-rise rental units. That approach has changed today in that it's not meant to be all concentrated, but 20,000 a year. And when you look at the National Housing Strategy marks, I think it's something like 10,000 over, it's not 10 years, 10,000 over 5 years. I'm getting that number wrong. But in terms of where we were to where we are, there's a huge gap, and that gap is what's created homelessness. In the early 90s, we totally cut federal funding. So it downloaded to the provinces and the municipalities, and zero federal funding was going into affordable housing. So what that looks like is our social housing stock, or our nonprofit housing, was at the height in 1972. We were looking at 35,000 or 32,000 units, all the way down to 2010 when we're barely even breaking 3,000 units. And again, even with the National Housing Strategy, we're nowhere near not even the numbers of like the late 80s. So that's a really important piece to think about. And as a result of this crisis, we've seen a huge shift in terms of how we respond, right? It's generally been focused on emergency responses, looking at shelters, looking at, you know, crisis supports, people having access to food banks, looking at basic need stuff, you know, clothing cupboards, all of that. And while that is important, we actually created a Band-Aid system of crisis response. We didn't actually invest resourcing into prevention, and we didn't invest it into accommodation and support. And unfortunately, our funding structures followed that. So there's an entrenchment in crisis response versus really looking at ending and reducing homelessness. The other part about this crisis response is it's complicated. It's a really complicated system for people to access the support that they need. And this is a big part of the work that's happening to be able to reduce homelessness, is working through the coordination piece. How do we get people to think differently about the resources that exist in a community? You know, when we think collectively of the resources, we actually have quite a lot. But when we think only of one agency providing this support, we tend to think a bit differently. And when we can zoom out a little bit and look at resources as collective, it really shifts how we respond and how we help people access those resources. The other big piece of this, housing loss is expensive. It costs way more money when people are funneled into provincial systems like hospitals and jails and shelter beds versus when we provide a rent subsidy for people to top off their rent to make it more affordable, or social or nonprofit housing. A vast difference in price. And again, because people have no choice, that's when they interact often with those other systems. The last I'd heard, there was something like 40% of people at Briere last June, I think it was, were actually stuck in alternative level of care beds because they had no housing. And that was the gap that existed there. So there's real challenges with that because we know what hospital stays cost. And we know that, provincial jail systems are not cheap. And unfortunately, when you don't have a home, these are the directions that people end up in because there's no safe place to be. So you have a higher incidence of likely encountering police if you don't actually have a place to go. So these are system pieces that are being addressed elsewhere and are being addressed in Ottawa as well, but really important to remember when we think about this. I'm just going to pause because I see 4 chats popping up. So I just want to make sure, are there any questions that people want to touch base on quickly now before I go on? We'll have time at the end too. All right, I will keep going. So the hopeful part, despite all of the bad news, is that communities across Canada actually are ending homelessness. They are reducing homelessness, they are focused on prevention, and they are actively ending it. And I think that's hopeful because there are things that we can apply here that are working elsewhere. So I think the one that I really want to look at is Edmonton. Edmonton's about the same size population as Ottawa, and they have seen a 43% reduction in overall homelessness over the last, that's been about 15 years. But that is significant. And if it can happen in a big city like Edmonton, it can happen here too. We've also seen in Waterloo, which is about half the size of Ottawa, our per capita family homelessness numbers are pretty much the same as Waterloo's when they were at the height of their family homelessness crisis. And they actually now, so they had about 200 plus people or family units in their shelter system. They now have 6. And those 6 are on the path to getting rehoused in a very short period of time. So it is absolutely possible and communities are making changes. We've also seen London, Ontario have a similar 50 to 60% reduction in family homelessness, very much by focusing on a similar to Waterloo model. And I should announce, because it was announced last week actually, that Medicine Hat has effectively eliminated chronic homelessness in their community. They announced that back in sort of 2015, but there's sort of a more rigorous assessment of what that actually looked like, and they are there at this point. So it is possible. I know Medicine Hat is a smaller city, but I think that's why it's good to have examples from multiple places that this is happening. So what's working? Systems coordination, that idea of really making sure that all the resources are targeted towards reducing and ending homelessness and that are working together, and affordable housing. I mean, I'm sure that's not a shock to anybody here, but those are really the key pieces. And we are seeing a lot on the systems coordination side and a growing amount of affordable housing. So for systems coordination, the big pieces are prevention and really digging into what that looks like within the homelessness system. It's also this idea of real-time data, i.e., can I look at the shelter system today and actually know how many people are homeless? How many people were homeless yesterday and how many people came into the shelter system in the last day? That's the kind of up-to-date data that we need because homelessness is dynamic. It's always changing, and having a count once a year doesn't cut it in order to be able to respond to people's needs. And finally, this idea of coordinated access, greater coordination across the homelessness sector and into those other systems that touch the homelessness sector. So I think this is a challenge. Right now, all of our funding, most of our approaches, most of our policy is really about driving people towards emergency crisis response. I actually heard a city staff the other day indicate that, we know when a family is in crisis, kind of at the cusp of eviction, it's really tough to get those eviction prevention resources. They do exist. We do have that resource, but it's difficult to access them. So how can we make that kind of access when we can see it coming to be able to help prevent people from entering into shelter in the first place? And we see this through a few things. Evictions prevention is a big piece of this. No discharges into homelessness. Those big provincial systems that I was speaking about, it's common for hospitals to discharge people straight to a shelter. It's far too common for jails to do the same thing. And the interesting thing about that is if you're in a longer term stay within a hospital or a jail, you actually have a window of prep time where you know that it's coming. And if somebody's homeless at intake, the clock should start at that point to be able to start to figure out somebody's housing situation. And that's changing, it's happening more and more, but not often enough and not in a comprehensive, consistent way. As well, I think what's really important to know is that the way to get resources in Ottawa's system is actually focused on crisis. So you have to get to the shelter before you can apply for a rent subsidy. You have to get to the shelter to be able to get a housing worker. And that's a really big challenge and approach. And so if we can divert people from even getting to the shelter in the first place, we're doing a better job. And that is something that we're learning from other models. And there's an opportunity to start to figure out what can that really look like. We do diversion now, but a lot of the time it's actually shelter workers doing diversion to not have people extend their stay. But if you're already at the shelter before we divert you, we're not actually taking that opportunity to try and move more upstream. So the coordination piece. So again, there are no silver bullets in ending homelessness. I'm not going to claim that there is a silver bullet. It's many, many different tools that need to be used. But I think coordinated access is a really important tool. It's that idea of basically having a streamlined access to resources in a community. It's actually been mandated under the federal government's homelessness strategy, Reaching Home. So now more and more communities have consistent standards for how the coordination can actually happen. And I think more guidelines. Some communities, including Ottawa, went out in front and tried to do this early on. But at this point, I think there's been a growing sense of what it can really look like when you dig into it and mature that process of coordination. So in Ottawa, we actually have one program that's coordinated access driven. There's 17 agencies that feed into that one program. But we actually have about 143 agencies that work in that homelessness space or serve people who are homeless. And we have over 300 programs. I think the number is actually much larger than that because housing touches almost every social service agency. But this is just by Googling homeless into 211, the online resource, and that's what we've come up with. So clearly there's a lot of work to do and you can't do it all at once, but there's kind of a concentric circle piece to that. You start with shelters, you move to day programs, you look beyond day programs to maybe community health centers. But all of these spaces work with people who are about to have a housing crisis, who may be coming out of a housing crisis, or who are currently homeless. So how do we respond to them in an integrated, coordinated way? So the first idea of coordination is every single door is the right door. No matter where you go, there's going to be consistency in how you're kind of moved through the system and supported to move through the system. That means that we need multiple access points. I thought something really interesting. I used to work with youth experiencing homelessness at sort of a system level, and many people were saying, we need text access for intake. I don't want to talk to somebody on the phone. It's too intimidating. I would way rather text. And that's something that we could do. That is absolutely possible. We also know, having very readily available online access to being able to connect to the system and the support you need is critical. Posters is something that we found actually in a recent, we hired 8 people who have lived experience of homelessness, and in advertising that job consistently, posters and then doing an intake over the phone was the way that people found out about the job, despite multimodal advertising for the positions. So what that also looks like is there's a common intake no matter where you go. It's the same form. You don't have to fill out multiple versions of your name and your birth date. And that we have the same script, right? That everyone's working off. We're trying to move towards housing stabilization. So how do we get there? And who do we need to connect you to? And I think the other piece is, the social service system is a menu of different options. How do we make sure the right person is getting the right resource? And that's going to look different for everybody. So the other big piece of this is real-time data. And what I was saying earlier about being able to, on a daily basis, understand who's in the shelter and what does that look like. We break it down into that individual level data. And we also look at, across the system, do we have a common number? Because what happens right now is every individual agency is tracking their numbers, but we don't know if those are the same people. They probably are going to lots of different services. And we're not able really to collectively say what our numbers look like in a comprehensive way. We know shelters, but we don't really have a sense of the broader system. So the person-specific data, this is something called the by name list, and this has actually been supported by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. This is required by the federal government Reaching Home Homelessness Strategy, and it kind of breaks data down into 3 parts. Who is coming into your system, who is new and coming in, who is currently homeless, and who is moving out. And then you kind of want to look like between all those folks, the people who are coming in, are they returning to shelter? Are they brand new to the system? And then when you look at similarly the outflow, are these folks who are getting housed, or are these folks who are maybe disappearing from the system? And the interesting thing is we do lots of outflow. We do a lot of helping get people housed, and we don't see the numbers go down. And it's because on the inflow side, we're not actually reducing the numbers of people moving into homelessness. And so until we start really focusing on prevention, it's super tough to get ahead. And, you know, Ottawa's done a great job at getting people housed over the last kind of 5 to 10 years with the 10-year plan, but we're not seeing the numbers go down. In fact, we're seeing it increase significantly. And then there's the system level data. I think a key piece that you see in communities reducing homelessness is that they're fixed on this goal. What is our common agenda? We want to collectively reduce homelessness, which means we have to have a collective number. And we need to know within that number if we're duplicating, if we're counting people differently, and that we have a communication system that enables that. We do, it's also mandated by the feds, but currently only shelters have access to that database. So moving into the affordable housing side, this is going to look super similar, I think, to what Stephanie had showed. And I want to break down kind of these 3 chunks of housing, because I think there's a lot of different terms that are thrown around when we talk about nonprofit housing. I very generically named it as nonprofit because what it is essentially nobody's making an extra buck. The only thing that's working is the fact that people are not increasing profit. They are not focused on making a broader income. They just need to maintain the asset. They need to be able to operate it and be financially sustainable, but there aren't shareholders involved. And basically it's run as a nonprofit agency. But then when you look in that kind of nonprofit spectrum, there's lots of different types. There's supportive housing where somebody actually may have significant supports. They'll probably have staff, sometimes 24/7 staff, where there's maybe even medical staff helping distribute medication. Then you look at sort of light touch supports where there might be social workers in a building, but it's kind of 9 to 5. It's not necessarily 24/7. And then you look at other things. Long-term care is a form of supportive housing. So it fits in that bubble of having that support. Similarly, transitional housing like halfway houses, like the word, it is non-permanent. So you wouldn't actually be in a position where you could stay indefinitely. And then social housing is that sort of, it's nonprofit, it's Ottawa community housing where it's specifically focused on rent geared to income. So what Stephanie was saying about that 30% of your income, whatever that income is, that's going to be the thing that drives the housing price for your rent. And also co-ops, as we've talked about. So there's a lot of different options within that nonprofit spectrum. And I think a key piece is normalizing nonprofit housing. We look at, European models. There's a lot of countries in Europe where 30 to 50% of the housing is nonprofit rental. Truly to drive towards having a community where we have no homelessness, that's the biggest difference that we need, is significant amounts and increase in nonprofit housing. Then you've got your private market rental, as we discussed. There's affordable rental. Increasingly, the tool we use are rent subsidies. How can we top up your rent? It's kind of like a minimum income to be able to make sure you're only paying 30% of your income, but you're renting in the private market. Rooming houses are another example of this. It's where a lot of folks who are just coming off the street end up. It's a 1-bedroom sort of situation, but they don't have a sink. It's usually shared sink and bathroom. But these are privately rented, but often there's some rooming houses that are good quality. There's a lot of rooming houses that are not good quality. Then you look at your standard market rental, and retirement homes too, as Stephanie mentioned, are part of this. So private market ownership, this is a no-brainer, but obviously the different types of housing people access. And I think I saw some really good questions in the chat around how to convert to the idea of shared housing or pieces like that. And that's where all the zoning conversations come in, right? A lot of land in Ottawa, including the recent urban boundary increase, I think we're adding something between 12 to 1,500 new hectares of land. That's happening in the next 5 years, and it's zoned for private market rental, which is something that if we really want to talk about housing affordability, we need to talk about gentle density and doing density well. And it doesn't look like single family homes predominantly. It's a part of it, but it's not all of it. And I think that's something that when we look to designing a city well for people to live, we need to really assess that piece. The two big strategies in affordable housing creation, but I think probably more important at this stage because of where we are, stopping the loss of existing affordable housing. There is a huge crisis right now in losing naturally occurring affordable units. And we need to also increase the nonprofit housing side. I think a common kind of misconception is that we can build our way out of the housing crisis. We can't, not because of the rate that we're losing housing, and even new supply. If that supply is all on the upper end of cost, that supply is irrelevant to the majority of people who need to have access to cheaper housing. So to give you a sense of the numbers, we are losing, this is Ottawa, across Canada, it's 15, so we're doing somewhat better. We lose 7 affordable units in the private market for every single affordable unit that we build in the nonprofit market. So we're not just not keeping pace, we're sinking. And until we stop the bleeding, we're not going to be able to move forward on making sure we have a city where everyone can live and afford to live. I think another piece to think about is who is losing that housing. And the people losing that housing are predominantly from racialized communities and minority communities. When we look at this pattern, it is an ongoing trend that has been, the situation for well over 50 years, I would say well over 100 years. But the Canadian examples of racialized communities being evicted from their housing, unfortunately, too many of these examples are in Ottawa. But further, I keep seeing these documentary videos from each of these examples. And it's interesting how frequently, 10 years after the fact, Africville in Nova Scotia, Little Burgundy in Montreal, Le Breton Flats in the 50s was a slum that was bulldozed. Still haven't replaced it with affordable housing. Lowertown was a Jewish and minority Francophone community. Herongate 2 years ago. Manor Village is happening as well. Herongate and Manor Village are 400 and 300 people respectively, or people being evicted from their homes for replacement of private market housing that is going to be too expensive for the people who used to live there. And I think what's really sad is you keep seeing this narrative of it could never happen again. And it's not only happening again, it's increasing in pace. So I think something Herongate is actually now back in the news. They're going to make a decision on June 24th at City Council. And I would encourage you to really push for the company of Timber Creek, now Hazelview, to look at sticking to their social contract. They agreed back in the fall to actually honor the fact that people could move back in who were evicted, and they could move back in at the same rate of rent. And now they're backing away from that commitment. And that's something that we can't let happen as a community. And we need to fight for people in our community who are losing their housing. And this is something that I'm certainly not against private development, but I think one of the frustrating things, we can't privatize human needs. We just can't, because when we do, the consumer, the individual has no leverage. We see this in the States with healthcare. If you need healthcare or triple bypass, you don't really have any bargaining power unless you're willing to die. And the same thing happens with housing. We have no leverage to be able to say, I choose not to have housing. And most people will spend their money on rent before they'll spend their money on food or other basic needs. And what we're seeing right now, and we're at particular danger of, is REITs, real estate investment trusts. So these large conglomerate companies that buy up existing rental housing. I think it's going to be happening with hotels as well. We have to look at the number of buildings, office buildings that are not going to be used. And REITs are already moving in and looking at how can we buy up these buildings and charge rent to pay off our mortgage. And housing becomes this place to just park capital. And that is not what we need to be doing with something that's a basic human right for people. So we have control over some of these pieces, and even at the municipal level, we can stop rent evictions. So similar to Herongate and Manor Village, what's happening, people getting evicted because that unit is going to be replaced for more expensive units. We've seen this a lot during the pandemic of people seeing housing prices increase, rental prices increase, and the owner making a call that they're going to evict people and then they're going to renovate. Technically, that's legal under the Landlord Tenant Act. And it's something that we're seeing significant increases in. As well as short-term rentals, Airbnb, it really sucks more of those affordable units out of the housing market. And we have seen a shift in that. In Ottawa, they have made a bylaw to reduce them. There's about 5,000 units in Ottawa that have been lost to that short-term rental market. The challenge is like actually enforcing it. How do you enforce that? Unless you're tracking Airbnb every day to look for Ottawa addresses. That's a tough thing to do. As well, tracking vulnerable properties. There are a lot of properties in the city and land where they're going to be flipped. We know that a building might be, decreasing in value. It may be decreasing in quality. That's the kind of building that a real estate investment trust wants to scoop up and renovate in order to build more expensive housing. So tracking that, New York City does this. This is something that's happening in other communities, and it's really effective for the city to be able to get ahead of that. So some ways to decrease nonprofit housing development or just to decrease the cost of housing for building is, nonprofit development, first of all. That's a huge piece of this. Public land. We know there are parcels of public land. Ottawa is particularly lucky because of the NCC. You look at things like building materials. Wood is cheaper than concrete. Thinking also about a sustainable building where you don't have the same amount of money going towards hydro and those sorts of things. So eco-friendly buildings have been shown to decrease operating costs, which is really important. And then we also look at, even with nonprofit housing, you still generally need to have rent subsidies in order to make it financially sustainable for the operating costs. It's easy to talk about capital costs and just building stuff. It's the operating costs long-term that really are the challenge for nonprofit housing. I'm just going to skip ahead because I think I've been talking too long. So one of the biggest things is, I think, culture. This is a culture shift. This is a case, a change management process for communities. It's thinking differently about how we look at housing. And I love this quote from, I think, a venture capitalist, which I probably shouldn't have used in the States, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. We can have all the best plans. We can have a great official plan. If as a community, we're unwilling to put our money where our mouth is, we're not going to get anywhere on making sure that we have affordable housing. So I think part of this is telling a new story. Communities are actually actively ending and reducing homelessness. Homelessness is coming from this systems issue and this 40-year story of de-investment in nonprofit housing. As well, I think something that resonates with people widely is that ending homelessness is less expensive than keeping us in a crisis, and it's better for our communities. So I think just one piece, what can you do? I would say advocate, spread the word, tell people we can end homelessness. And something that's really critical, embracing yes in my backyard. How do we as communities welcome nonprofit housing? How do we welcome new units and make sure they're integrated into the community? So it's not one building of all nonprofit housing, but it's scattered site. We have people in private development buildings have in actually affordable units through things like inclusionary zoning. And I do just want to say on the advocacy side, about to launch next week is a national campaign with the Canadian Alliance called Vote Housing. It is nonpartisan, but the intention is to focus on housing should be the deciding decision of this election. And knowing where our future parties will stand on housing, I think is one of the most significant issues that we can address. If we get housing right, we get a lot of downstream health outcomes, social determinants of health, people having better education, food security. When people only pay 30% of their income on rent, that is poverty reduction. And so when we do this right, we see significant downstream effects. And that's something that I think we all need to be fighting for. I'm gonna stop. I think that is my last slide. And just the thought that we truly can end homelessness. It's happening elsewhere and we have the chance to do it as well. So I encourage you to get in touch with the Alliance if that's of interest and see how you can be a part of this as well.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Katie. Tremendous amount of information in both these presentations, and I didn't realize how technical and how many moving parts there are in both the area of affordable housing and homelessness. Let's open it up to questions. There are some comments and questions on the chat line. So I'm just going to go back a little bit and see what we have. Let's see now. Let me just see what we have.
Okay, if I can throw the co-op idea out there. I've always wondered about, okay, the Harris government quashed the subsidy on co-ops housing, but I always wondered, you know, I don't care about the subsidy. It's just how do we develop co-op housing within Ottawa, if as an example, because I know many people, the idea that they want to be part of something. I don't know what the minimum is to build a co-op, you know, how many people have to be in it, how big the property has to be. But, you know, there's people like that would, I mean, I'd give my side yard for like a co-op housing to just say, hey, how many people can we get in here? And how do we make a co-op? Because I know that David Chidichenko is just down the road here, and it used to be the big thing. It's co-op housing. And I know there's co-housing, but it's more difficult because it's about sharing your kitchen. So I think it's a co-op is the thing that I'm feeling is the missing link here.
I'm just curious where you are, Sharon.
I'm in Ottawa, in Old Ottawa South, a stone's throw from Carleton University, but I'm an American immigrant here. And after I finished university, I came here in the late 80s or something, mid 80s. So then, I got a little house and then got a single detached house that was like needed lots of work and fixer upper kind of thing. But to me, like, I've had friends in the Glebe, we're Quakers, I'm a Quaker. So we're going to try to buy the side lot on the Quaker meeting house and build an affordable place for seniors to live, like things like that. Like people are trying to think outside the box here, but is there anything in the system right now we can access that helps us make a co-op?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say you could probably look at the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. Check out their website. There's tons of information there. But from my understanding of a co-op, so as a group, you guys would have to become incorporated. So a co-op is owned by a corporation, and then the individuals who are part of it don't own the unit specifically. It's the corporation that owns it, and then you become like a shareholder. So you're buying shares of the corporation, and so if you were to leave, then that property is not yours. So that's yeah.
And that's in fact the key to me. I think it's this issue that you need to own from beginning to the end of your life doesn't make sense. And I was in London when we were basically taking over old houses, and people were building co-op housing, and they didn't care about the ownership. You were just part of a collective. And I think the collective idea is like a 70s thing, or sort of a edge of the 80s, but then it's gone and never returned. And I wonder why.
Yeah. So do look at the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, and of course there'd be zoning issues, right? So again,
it's fighting with the city over why is it so hard to like do what we're like on the edge of. We're trying to think outside the box, but like it seems like everything is against anybody who does anything that's not like luxury condo development.
Yeah, it's an area that there needs to be major zoning, I think, changes, but the official plan is trying to encourage more of that. But with co-ops, there's about 42 co-ops in Ottawa already. But what you see a lot of the time is, you see the big in Ottawa Community Housing and CCOC, Centertown Citizens of Ottawa Corporation. They're not totally formal co-ops. Ottawa Community Housing is social housing, but they build a lot because they have existing assets. So one of the biggest, most important pieces, I'm not saying all 42 co-ops need to partner, but you could actually leverage your existing assets in order to mortgage finance. And that's why some of the bigger people are being able to do it. And so that's something that, you're seeing an increase in that somewhat, but it's a really key piece. And just to give you a sense of cost, like $10 million gets you like 40 to 60 units. It does not get you a lot, right? And so we talk about, I know the Porsche dealership was a sensitive topic a few weeks ago. I'd be surprised if you could get, 10 units from $3 million for capital, and that doesn't even speak to operating. So I think the scale of the money is important, but how do you leverage what you've got? So you already have land, which is great, and you're already looking at a building, which is also great. So remortgaging, that kind of financial nimbleness is what a lot of community agencies are starting to do more and more to build more housing, including the shelters.
And I just want to go back about the co-op. Sorry, I'll finish. The co-ops seem to be like, it goes back to, if I was homeless and I had to navigate the system to get in housing, it's how difficult it is. It's like I'm coming back in a time machine after being out of the country for 20 years. And it's like, hey, what happened? Like, where's the women's centers? Where's the housing help that I used to hear about and know about? And now I feel that it's about making it accessible and not a maze, as you put it. I don't want it to be, people just do, it's too complicated. I don't want to think about it. So it needs to be demystified. The city needs to be not against it, which is hard to do, but just to do one model, like do a pilot project, like make it work, show that it does work. Okay.
I just want to say exactly to your point, Sharon, that seniors watch, but it's Old Ottawa South. It's part of Oscar. This is exactly, I'm an advisor. It's part of their first draft of their strategy to partner with people in the community of Old Ottawa South. So this is like a pilot in a neighborhood, keeping people in their neighborhood and making many more affordable options, but also where you can increase the level of service and not be in a large seniors home, for example, or a large long-term care place. Aging in place, they're looking specifically at partnering with individuals with existing property in Old Ottawa South with possibilities of either that piece or extending it or adding in another house. They're looking at all these possibilities. There's several people on this housing committee that are involved with, one is Mary Huang. Do you know her,
Mary
Stephanie?
Huang?
Huang. She's actually involved with, she's on Council on Aging, and they're just some real activists who are mostly linked to Old Ottawa South. That's why you're in the perfect neighborhood, especially with your link to the Quakers and what they did with the church property, like building those, I guess they're condos or townhomes. And then if they've got extra property, I mean, you've got all kinds of possibilities. And the Old Ottawa South group is not just looking at Old Ottawa South. They're also looking at the Glebe and Centertown. They're looking at communities in a larger sense. They're specifically trying to help those living in the neighborhood. And they're definitely looking at intergenerationality because they've got all the Carleton students. They've got a huge number of high school students who need those hours for volunteering. And they haven't yet focused on it. They've got a lot of different possibilities. They're trying to narrow it to affordable and housing, staying in your neighborhood, aging in place, whether that be in your own home, in sharing your own home, developing your own home with possibly this group. And they're looking at talking to the city to CMHC. So you wouldn't be alone.
Well, can I ask the question, what is the minimum number for a co-op? Like I heard you say 40 to 60 units for $10 million in development. And yes, I understand that's what this community needs, but is there such a thing as a co-op with like 10 units?
I'm sure there is. I think Stephanie and Karen would know more.
Well, there are different kinds of co-ops, right? I mean, a co-op in New York is, you've got equity co-ops, and then you've got, we lived in the Shefford downtown for many years. My ex-husband and friend still lives there, an artist, and on the list for Powell, by the way, David. But in the perfect place because he's got community. He's got a range of affordable housing in his own unit if he decides to stay in that place. and a sense of community. But my point, Shefford, that was turned from an existing building by Evelyn Gigantes and a huge team of volunteers. It was a huge effort back in 1991. So it had been going on from the 80s. And that was when there was still the political will to create co-ops. And as your presentations were terrific, Stephanie and Katie. Thank you very much, because I've got all kinds of numbers and much more of a context than I've had before. I really appreciate that. And I think it's great that PAL Ottawa is linking through me, and possibly through you, David, with SWOOS, which is SWOOS, based as part of the OSCAR, so the Old Ottawa South Association, or whatever they're called. But you know, so they could function as pilots.
Yeah.
And in each of these groups, there are people who are very keen on whether they themselves are very comfortable or not, very interested in helping this along. This whole affordable housing issue is such a foundational piece, especially for aging.
I think, you know, the whole idea of, you know, moving out of your home and moving into, I mean, I've just heard of so many examples of people wanting to downsize and move into incredibly expensive retirement homes at $6,000 a month. Frankly, I don't get it. You know, the whole idea of downside, I mean, wherever you're going to live, you're going to have to still have your kitchen clean, your bathroom clean. You're still going to have to vacuum. Yard work is not really, getting somebody to do your yard work is not that expensive. I guess maybe you save on property taxes, but it just seems that I know most, and the other thing is that the incentive the incentive to move into, let's say, a long-term care facility, a nursing home, unless you're fully, you know, God forbid you've had Alzheimer's or a stroke or something, but short of that, I've seen so many examples of, you know, couples that have moved into nursing homes, I feel prematurely. I think it's really premature. And, you know, we know the story. We know this. We're going to be having a presentation on Friday about nursing homes, but the good, the bad, and the ugly. But we know the state of nursing homes, and they're not great places to go. So the longer people can stay in their homes and bring in supports, you know, if you can afford to pay for extra home care, but also, you know, to pressure the government for additional services like physiotherapy and home care and massage therapy and all these types of things. It's really important. Katie, I don't want to dominate the discussion. Katie, I just have a question for you. I used to work for the Ministry of Health in Toronto. I worked there for 18 years, and I actually worked in mental health and addictions. So part of the work we were doing, this is 30 years ago, and part of the work we were doing was on homelessness as well, because obviously, I think it's about 40% of the homeless population is estimated to have alcohol addiction and or mental health issues. And one of the programs we ran, it was ran actually in Caledon outside of Toronto, and it was called Peace Ranch. And it was for people that were homeless, but also had mental health and addictions problems. And it was basically, I thought it was a very innovative program at the time, but basically, you know, it was about a residential facility on sort of a farm, rural environment, and the residents would be involved in, you know, farm chores and things like that, taking care of the animals, you know, horses and sheep and goats and things like that. And they were out of the city, you know, they were out of the Byward Market, where they're, you know, hanging around with other people that aren't exactly advancing their physical, mental, and emotional health. So do you know of any other programs like that are being developed by any of the agencies that you're working with?
You know, a lot of it, because if it's supportive housing, like the staffing resourcing is the challenge. So a lot of them are building on site because staffing is easier. But similar to you, I always think I used to work right at Murray and King Edward at Center 454.
Right.
And we always had a picnic once a year in the summer. And I was so struck by the fact that we'd go to Meech Lake and the person who was, walking into traffic, not doing well the day before, the person who was screaming at somebody else, again, not doing well, would be like flipping burgers and leading the volleyball team, right? Like environment matters. I completely agree with you. And just all of that use, like I have not met many people who are using substances. I don't know if I've met anyone, to be honest, who are chronically using substances that haven't had pretty significant trauma, right? So I think that's the other thing that drives this and often isn't recognized as part of it. So there's a few, I know Operation Come Home has like a farm, there's a residential facility, Harvest House is like that. It's a bit in the country. It's not that common though, to my knowledge. And mental health and substance use services specifically tends to be a bit different in terms of a residential facility than what's happening. There's usually an insight or a safe injection spot with some of the other services, but it's not providing housing plus. So that's a bit of I don't know if it's a tension, but sort of how services seem to be working at this point.
Okay.
But we should do more of that. Nature, vitamin N, right? Like it matters to people so much.
Yeah, we really need some out of the box thinking. And, you mentioned the reduction in homelessness in Edmonton and Medicine Hat. And I know in Portland, Oregon, they've come up with a really interesting model as well. I think there was a piece on 60 Minutes a few years ago about it. But yeah, we really need to take some bold steps here. And that the advocacy for the community, whether to Sharon's point on cooperative housing or whatever, politicians are going to respond. Like politicians don't make something an issue; it's really the people that make it an issue. And if it has to be an election issue, long-term care is a great example. Long-term care is a mess. No air conditioning. Come on, that's not acceptable. So, we have to make it an issue. And letter writing, emails, phone calls, meetings, that's really the way of doing it.
So I was glad you guys brought the homelessness you gave the platform for homelessness and affordable housing, which makes sense, but you kind of brought it together into a matrix that really helps sort of as it makes it accessible for people to see, oh yeah, like how could people are being made homeless from COVID who actually had decent housing, own their house, and suddenly don't have a house and don't have a job. And so, and also the film Nomadland showed that people don't have housing and are 65 or 70 years old and still trying to work, and how they do it. That was a great convergence there. And to me, I worked in Philadelphia with the homeless community for 4 years in an experimental rehabilitation center where we took people off the streets and then gave them purpose. It was like the whole idea was taking them out of a bad situation, putting like a dozen people in an old ramshackle building that we fix up, and then we find individual rehabilitation on psychiatric level. And so I'm sort of immigrated as a social worker because I had the experience, but I basically studied documentary film and all of that. And then I'm up here doing the One Real Film Festival. So we had the film Blue Roses, which I hope you guys know about. So we premiered that in the last couple of years. And last night I talked to somebody about a follow-up to Blue Roses, which is how at the vigil at the Human Rights Monument last night, all these people, we got together and accidentally started talking about these issues after the vigil, because we're all there together and everybody's been masked and kept away from each other. But now we're sort of reconnecting. And I feel like it's being solution oriented and not problem focused. I don't want to be against anything. I just want to be for something that we can be behind and make it go another step forward. So that's why I ask about the models, like really, how do we make a co-op model? How do we just do it so that we can see, oh, that works. Or tiny houses, I'm very passionate about. How come we can't have a little tiny house parking lot? I mean, because it's because of the plumbing. It's all because you could detach your house and move away and not play. I heard this. They can't make you pay your property tax if you can move your house.
That's fascinating.
Wow, like, is that why you can't see a tiny house in Ottawa? He said, yes, because of the toilet.
Yeah. They did make secondary suites available, and Lanark County, actually, there's an expert there who has just done a ton of zoning change work to make tiny houses work for youth in Lanark County. So that's something, and they partnered with Algonquin College, but it was that, right? It's where's the plumbing hookup? How do we figure out who gets electricity? What does this look like? But are moving forward on it, but it's taken a couple of years of just that, right? The zoning pieces that have to happen.
Yeah, and it's sort of elite because it's even the guys who can build a tiny house can't quite afford just to build a tiny house, and where do you build it?
Yeah.
But I'd still say it's just that, wouldn't it be heroic? And I don't know why Ottawa hasn't taken its transport hubs and just said, we need to build housing for people that don't have cars around the transport hubs, because they own the land, they controlled it, and it didn't happen. But it could still happen. I figure that the weird thing is LeBreton Flats is this mysterious, weird, ghosty, sort of haunted place where they crushed everybody. I lived in South Africa, in Cape Town. Literally, they completely crushed the whole communities, and nothing is there. They've never built anything. And the same thing is in LeBreton Flats. They've crushed all these houses, and nothing ever got built there. So maybe this is a good time to push for that old historic problem. It's like a haunted slavery problem. Like, maybe we could fix something there just to show that there could be some movement. Because I don't know Heron Gate, I don't know what's going to happen, but I said literally the protest was just this past Saturday, and it still seems kind of unstable. Like,
Yeah, I mean, they've backed off. Sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of the Joni Mitchell song. They took Paradise and put up a parking lot.
Here it is.
But actually, now with now with
the headline,
a lot of the malls are done. Yeah, we won't go away. A lot of the malls are just dying, like on Maryville Road.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those. I mean, a lot of those malls are downsized. You've got a lot of asphalt parking lots that could be to paraphrase Joni Mitchell's song, be converted to housing, but it's got to be the right type of housing,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a combination of affordable and just regular housing.
Yeah. And that's actually the plan for LeBreton Flats, right? There's been a commitment within 500 meters of transit paths. There's been a commitment in the official plan and by the city to make sure that affordable housing is integrated. And I just want to add, I think one of the key pieces about bringing this to elected officials, we have to change the frame of the conversation, because a lot of the time we focus on the individual and we don't focus on the system. And, we created homelessness. It didn't exist. Mass homelessness did not exist before basically the late 80s, early 90s. But people using substances and mental illness, that's always been around, right? So I think we have to look at that difference. It is a structural policy choice. And if we focus on the individual piece, I think we really run into it's very easy to get to people need to fix themselves, right? As opposed to, we have a system that's not working. It's so clearly not working. And I just want to share a quote I heard yesterday from FDR that is to your point, David. I agree with you. This was an advocacy group he met with. I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it. Right? It's voters. We are the ones who control what politicians do. Can we make it a voting issue or not?
That's right. That's a great adage to live by. Well, listen, we're running on 11:50. Lunchtime is close. I really want to thank Stephanie and Katie for an invigorating discussion. Yeah, like I said earlier, you really packed a lot of information in both presentations, and your slides were great, your resources. So thank you so much for doing this. And perhaps at some point in the future, we'll have a repeat performance and here maybe in a year or whatever to hear how the progress is going. So I want to really thank you for this. I also want to just a shout out to the City of Ottawa for funding today's presentation. The next presentation will be on Friday by Peggy Edwards, who actually was my neighbor on 2nd Avenue. I'm dating myself here, my age, but in 1956, when I was very small, she was our next door neighbor. So I haven't seen her well, you can do the math. So it's a long time. So she'll be speaking about long-term care. There will be, as I mentioned earlier at the top, this presentation by Stephanie and Katie will be posted on our PAL YouTube channel. I would encourage you to go back and watch it because, as I said, there's a lot of information. I was taking a lot of notes, but I'm going to go back because I want to educate myself more on this topic. And there will be a survey sent out by Matthew Behrens, probably next week or so, about today's presentation. And if you wouldn't mind filling it out, because it will inform our funders as well as PAL Ottawa, inform our funders as to how we're doing, and also inform PAL Ottawa in terms of future presentations. And I would also encourage you, when you do go to the PAL YouTube channel, to hit share and like and provide any comments you have about the presentation, about today's presentation, to myself at supportingcast@palottawa.org. That's supportingcast, all one word, at palottawa.org, and for narrative comments. So, and also any donations to PAL Ottawa are welcome. And please check out our website, because there's a lot of really good stuff on it, and it's being updated all the time. So thank you again to our guests, Stephanie and Kate, for a very invigorating discussion, to our audience, and hope to see you at future events. So thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.